biology and bioengineering in the 21st century. Let us meet our guest speaker, Professor Graham Paul, who will join us at the summer camp. Currently, he is a professor at Nottingham-Trent University, UK. Professor Paul supervises the bioinformatics team at NTU and guides undergraduate and postgraduate research projects. He obtained his PhD in July 1996 after studying at the Trent Polytechnic, now the Nottingham-Trent University. He has worked as a professor of bioinformatics at Nottingham-Trent University since 2010. He has 25 years of experience in the development and application of bioinformatics algorithms using artificial neural networks and other machine learning techniques. Areas of interest include machine learning, precision medicine, deep learning, bioinformatics, systems biology, molecular driver identification, drug target identification, understanding molecular processes in drug repurposing, in silico prototyping of diagnostic data mining of complex data sets. We are really excited to have with us Professor Graham Paul. See you at the summer camp.
All right, great. So let me now invite Professor Graham to share his screen and talk to all of you about some of the key concepts in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning for various biological questions to be addressed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to meet you. I'm talking to you from a very wet and windy Nottingham at the minute, and I will talk to you about some of my areas of interest and some principles behind those areas of interest. So I'll just share my screen now, and okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So this is very much a new or relatively new and emerging area, but that's had a lot of work on it over the last sort of 40 or 50 years even. And we all are hearing about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And what I want to try and do today is introduce some of those concepts. And I'm aware that the audience might be quite general, but also because these are complex topics, just to explain some of the principles behind how these things work and a little bit of how we might use them to find things of use and to help benefit humanity. So we are effectively using artificial intelligence to try and solve problems. And it was Albert Einstein who said that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And in a way, we are kind of using a new consciousness here, an artificial consciousness or semi-consciousness, to try and understand and identify patterns in things. So, yeah, the human brain is, some people could argue, is a form of a computer. And what I'm doing here is comparing these to the computer brain, the artificial brain. And a good example of that is a multi-layer perceptron, which is a form of learning. And the human brain is very complicated. There are more connections in the human brain than there are known stars in the night sky, for example. So about 1 quadrillion connections. Whereas, machine learning has connections, and it's those connections that we use to identify patterns and to memorize features in systems. And they may have up to probably 1 million connections now. The area we work in, we work on a few less than that, but so-called deep learning methods, which many of you may have heard about, but deep learning is a kind of a new method that's coming about for analyzing complex data, such as image data. And there you might have 1 million connections, but certainly nowhere near the number of connections that we have in the human brain. Both these systems, interestingly, use about 30 watts of power. So a computer chip uses about 30 watts. In terms of energy use from biological energy, we use about 30 watts. The human brain has a processing speed of around 100 hertz, so 100 processes per second. Whereas processing speeds of computers are in the order of gigahertz, and in some level of parallelism to that. The other difference between what we're trying to do with the human brain is the human brain tends to have a level of organization, but it's multi-directional. There's lots of connectivity, lots of different architectures in terms of the neuronal structures in the brain. But for the computer, it's a very ordered, very structured input, output type mechanism. Now, the human brain is very error tolerant. We all get things wrong often. Whereas if there's an error in a computer system, it will either stop a process or it will completely shut down the computer. So the human brain is very tolerant and prone to error. And it would not help from a survival perspective or an evolutionary perspective if we were to shut down as soon as we got something wrong. And but computers are not very tolerant. We get the so-called blue screen of death, where a computer screen goes blue and the computer has broken, for want of a better word. And the human mind is also, or the human brain is also capable of learning in many ways. The brain can store information, we can memorize things, we can inference things, we can find the patterns in things and gaps in things and fill them in. We can also extrapolate and postulate based upon memory and thought. Whereas in computers, predominantly using conventional ideas, there's only really kind of memorization based upon error and feedback. We don't really truly have an inference engine at the minute. A computer can't really infer what's going to happen unless it really has seen those patterns before. Now, the human mind is very good at finding patterns, but it can't conduct a task repetitively for large numbers of parameters. Whereas computers are very good at searching systematically through such complex data and finding patterns out from that. And this becomes particularly important in the era of big data. So you may all have heard about big data. This is where we are dealing with tens of thousands of variables for, in some cases, millions of records. And biology is a good example of big data, where we have 30 or 23,000 or so genes in the human genome. Those code for potentially hundreds of thousands of proteins, and sifting through all of that information to try and find patterns and find features is very difficult. And the human mind shuts down very quickly because it can't cope with the complexity, whereas a computer can systematically search through that. So why do we want to use AI? Well, AI is a tool that we can use for decision making. And so it might be the decision is, how do we treat a person with a particular disease? Or it might be, does this person have a cancer or not? Or does this person have a risk of developing a disease? Or if they have a disease, what is the risk for that individual? And more than conventional statistical methods like t-tests and regression and the like, AI can cope with a level of complexity, the sort of complexity we get in molecular data. Now, if we have a yes-no answer, disease, no disease, for example, then the decision-making process or the decision maker that we develop is called a classifier. So when we use machine learning or AI, we often will want to develop a classifier, a system that predicts something from something else. But sometimes we may want to predict continuous values. So that would be where we have for example, a regression-based approach. And so how do we do this? Well, one of the so before I get onto that, these are some examples of AI, both real and perhaps imagined. But so this is to illustrate that we don't really have true AI. So here we've got an example of an Amazon Echo Dot, and that has a level of simulated intelligence. The simulated intelligence being the ability to recognize words and then apply those words somewhat autonomously to web-based data. So, the examples of this being Siri, Alexa, and Google. So that's really kind of a simulated AI. The next kind of level of decision making has a level of deeper learning as well. So something like a Tesla, which has self-driving capability, is an AI which is making thousands of decisions as to whether to start or to steer a car based upon input from an array of sensors. So again, that Tesla is making a decision, has a decision or multiple decision processors in order to be able to drive the vehicle autonomously. So that's a form of AI, but it's very targeted on a very small area, the ability to drive. It's not simple, but it's a very narrow focus. And the example I'm using is what most people use as to why we shouldn't have AI. And this is the Terminator robot from the films. And that, you could argue, has autonomous true AI, and it's following a set of guidelines, routines, based upon information it receives, but it has a goal. But at the end of the day, most AI that we use, or all of the AI pretty much that we use, is very targeted and focused on a particular task at hand. And in the biosciences, that task might be to find markers that address a particular problem we have with a given disease or diagnostic. So the way we make these decisions is something called a decision boundary. And you can imagine a cloud of data looking something like this, where we have lots of variables, all interconnected, all interrelated, and a very, very complex problem. And what we want to do with our decision boundary is find a rule or a line that cuts through that data, allowing us to make decisions. So for example, it could be looking through the whole proteome or the whole transcriptome, all of the molecular data for a set of individuals in a population, to try and work out whether, if they have a cancer, whether it's metastatic or not metastatic. And what we do in our AI and our modeling methods are to try and define this line. So creating a system that can classify or differentiate between classes. So, for example, if we have a system that can say this patient has a high-risk cancer, a metastatic cancer, or this patient has a low-risk cancer, a non-metastatic cancer, then we have a decision support system. We have a classifier. So these decision boundaries are what effectively allows us, and in these diagrams, we're trying to separate out the O's from the X's. It's a rule, and that separates the two. Now here we have a straight line rule. It's a simple rule, mathematically, y equals mx plus c, that says anybody who has a value above the line is an O, anybody has a value below the line is an X. And you can see it gets some of those wrong because it's linear and it's constrained. So this might be the example of conventional statistical modeling, where we have a very simple rule that we're trying to apply and test, a very linear rule. But we can also get more complicated models, and We have a problem in big data sometimes called overfitting, where we're able to predict very well for a set of cases, but as soon as we apply new ones in, new cases that haven't been seen before, then we get it wrong. So our goal ultimately is to try and find a simple decision boundary that separates out between the O's and the X's here, or separates out between cancer, non-cancer, or high risk, low risk. Now, this is an illustration of the sort of example of that. So, we have our, this is a well-known UK suite, well-known UK candy, and we have a set of healthy individuals. We have a set of individuals who have cancer. We want to try and fit a rule that separates out the two. And that rule is represented here by this blue line. So that rule could be an expression level of one protein plus expression level of another protein, and that is what defines that line. Now, just to illustrate quickly how computers are better than people at finding patterns, we'll just show how this works. So this is a hypothetical expression array, and here with a simple 3x3 array, you can see the differences between the two, unless you're red-green colorblind, which I apologize for. So here you can see that there's one dot that has a red dot in this individual and a yellow dot in this individual. Otherwise, the remaining bits of the array are the same. So that's quite a simple problem. You can spot that difference quite easily. And the human mind is very good at spotting simple differences. It's a survival mechanism. Then if we make this more complicated, now we have a bigger array. And you can see there are a couple of differences now between these two. And they were relatively easy to spot, although a little bit more complicated because the array was bigger. Now we're trying to look for consistent differences. In other words, differences between this group on the left and this group on the right. So if it's consistently different between this group and this group, then that's what we want to try and find. It's getting harder now, as you can see. But to make it easy for you, I'll show you where consistent differences are and where the inconsistent differences are. Then we're starting to get to something a little bit more like what happens in an expression array or a very complex biological data set. And we start to see that some differences are there. You could probably spot those. And then this is what really happens. We can have potentially hundreds of individuals in group A, hundreds of individuals in group B, and 20,000 pieces of information for each of those groups, each individual in each of those groups. And then you see now the human mind can't cope. There's just too much information to deal with that. You might be able to systematically go through, but you're going to have problems. Your mind will wander, or your mind will, it will take a very long time. But machine learning can look at these and look at 50 million of these dots per hour easily. So one form of machine learning that we use is a form of artificial neural network. And this is based upon learning in the human brain, the neuronal networks of the brain. And we have a network of interlinked nodes. And these nodes and this network can represent information relating cause and effect, in fact. It's a widely used approach. It's the basis of deep learning as well. It's nonlinear. And these processes, or these algorithms, literally learn patterns based upon feedback. So we'll present it with a set of individuals who are healthy, a set of individuals who have cancer, and it will be able to learn the differences between those two populations. And when it's very good at predicting those, and then we test it with new individuals who it hasn't seen before, and if it's good at predicting for those as well, then we have a good decision support system that allows us to predict cancer as a diagnostic tool. So this really kind of shows the neural network, the principles of it. We have an input and an output. The input values are transformed mathematically into an output value. So here, this diagram we see down here on the bottom right, that is effectively inputs. So the input could be a gene or a protein. We have a mathematical conversion layer, which is called the hidden layer. And that takes the sum of the values, applies a function to them. And then those are individual hidden nodes in that layer are combined into an output layer. So we can relate mathematically a pattern to a question using this approach. And the method, the ANN will learn a solution to that problem. It will look for patterns in the data and combine those to be able to make a prediction. For example, cancer, non-cancer. So we change the weights of that neural network by what's called a back propagation algorithm. The weights are randomized. The ANN makes a prediction. We tell it what actually happened. You get an error. That error is then used to update those weights and make better predictions next time round. So it learns, much in the way a small child might learn to walk. They start up, they toddle for a bit, they might fall over and hurt their hands or their knees, but that's the error. Then they will get up and try again slightly differently. And by that iterative process of feedback and reinforcement, they will learn to walk and learn the pattern of walking. So how does a neural network work? Well, as I said, we have an input layer, which could represent our genes or proteins. And that's then fed through, because it's a feed-forward neural network. And then it makes a prediction, so it compares to what actually happened. That prediction has an error, and then that error is fed back. So it's a feed-forward back propagation neural network. So what it's doing is effectively updating these weights in this network to be able to mathematically predict from the input values and output value. So it keeps feeding forward, back propagating. And you can see the weights here are represented by a thickness of a line, and it feed forwards, back propagates, and effectively those weights update in accordance to that error. And in that way, it learns to make a prediction. So once it's trained, then we can plug numbers into the input. They will feed through the neural network and produce a prediction of the question we're asking. And that prediction will be in the form of a probability. So for example, if it's healthy disease, it will be the probability of an individual having that disease based upon the input values. So once we have that, we have a model that allows us to predict the relation, what's going to happen for an individual. So if I go back to our decision boundary to visualize it, we have the same population as before. Now, what this is doing is, instead of putting a straight line linear decision boundary in, it's now putting multiple sigmoid functions. And the neural network, or logistic functions, the neural network uses these logistic functions in it and combines them into a model that can predict. So you can see now a non-linear function is much better at predicting than a linear one. So just going back to this, each one of these hidden nodes represents a logistic function. So with a 2 hidden node neural network, we can stitch together 2 different logistic functions to be able to predict the question we're trying to answer. This one uses 3. So you can see here is the first logistic function. Second moves to there, and the third moves to there. And using just 3 hidden nodes, we were able to separate out the healthy from the cancer cases using that decision boundary. So that's a method. We use it a lot. We are using it in the prediction of outcome in COVID. We're using it to predict cancer. We're using it to identify new medicines by analyzing molecular data predominantly. So we look at the molecular characterization of a disease state, and then we use these methods to sift through all of that data to try and find patterns in it that allow us to predict something through a population of individuals. So for example, we might take the blood of 100 individuals. Each individual will have a particular status, and then we will look for patterns in the molecular profile derived from, say, mass spectrometry or expression arrays, or RNA-seq. And then from that, we're able to predict which genes or proteins can predict the disease state. So I mentioned a little bit about deep learning, and the Tesla that I showed you uses a form of deep learning. It's a deep neural network because it's dealing with image data. And what's commonly used, this is a deep learning neural network. You can see it's literally got hundreds and hundreds of hidden nodes in multiple layers, and all of that information is passed through, and you can start to find second and third order features from this deep learning. It's the molecule A plus molecule B combined in a different way with molecule C applied to do two different functions will predict. Whereas another approach we use, particularly for molecular data, is a more constrained architecture, and that would just have, say, 2 or 3 hidden nodes. It learns very quickly and can filter out a lot of the weaker elements or less predictive elements in the data. So what we're aiming to get to is, let's say we're applying this to identify who will respond to a particular drug. We have a mixed population of individuals, some who will respond, some who won't, or some who will respond to drug A and some who will respond to drug B. What we then do is we then profile those individuals. And this is showing an expression array. So we're profiling here all the RNA level, all the expression of all the individuals' genes. So we have that for a population. And then we will use the neural network to predict the key genes and combine them into a model that allows us to then predict whether an individual should have treatment A or should have treatment B. So effectively, the neural network has learned a solution to the problem of who should be treated with what drug. And from there, those individuals will be able to be treated correctly, because we'll have a model that can predict that for them based upon the expression of their genes in a particular sample. Now, so that's neural networks. Another method, which is commonly used, is what's called a support vector machine. And again, this method identifies a decision boundary by effectively projecting a vector through the data to that separability between two populations. So it's a supervised learning approach, and it effectively defines the boundary between individuals in different classes. What's the decision boundary between individuals who have cancer versus individuals who are healthy? And what it relies on is what's called a kernel. And the kernel is the function that maps the boundary between the two different individual groups. And then that kernel can be a linear function, it can be a logistic function, sigmoid, it can be a logistic function, a log function, or a radial basis function, which is a sphere. And basically this function, the weights of it are adjusted to maximize the distance between the points and the boundary for all individuals in the population. So what that would look like is, again, we have our decision boundary. What it's doing is measuring the distance between every individual and the line. And then it moves the line and until that distance is maximized. And that line is what is called the support vector. That's why it's called a support vector machine. So it's moving the line around until it gets the best solution. But it could also be moving a sphere around. It could be moving an S-shaped curve around. And it's doing that in order to maximize the separation between the green people and the yellow people here. Or between the green sweets and yellow sweets, I should say. So that's a support vector machine. Now, another third approach that's commonly used is a decision tree and a random forest. And basically, a decision tree is a set of rules that are nested that can split the population into different classes. So it's a nest of rules that says, if this, go down this branch, if that, go down that branch, and basically can split the data into pure or mixed classes. And then it will subsequently split individuals further into subclasses and subclasses. So decision tree is a way effectively of saying, making a set of rules that splits the population. So if we go back to our mixed population, we have here the derivation of the first rule. So you can see what it's doing is moving this horizontal line, which is taking the value of X until it gets to a point where it has a mixed class, which is here on the right-hand side, and a pure class, which is on the left-hand side. Once it's got that rule, then it will, you can see now here, if the rule is less than X1, then it goes down to pure class, and it's got those individuals correct. And then goes, if it's greater than X1, it goes down to mixed class, and then takes that split and takes it a stage further. So now we have another rule, and that rule is looking again for a mixed class and a pure class. So that rule is X2. So if the value is less than X2, then it's a mixed class. If it's greater than X2, it's a pure class. So that would look like this. We've already split using the rule X1. Then we split the mixed class using a rule X2. And so you can see if it's greater than X2, it's a pure class. If it's less than X2, it's a mixed class. Still, we haven't got every individual classified, so we would need to go to a third level. And then what we're now doing is looking at the variation in Y. And by moving the value for Y until we get effectively a pure class, we may also have to move it, have to have multiple rules in Y. But here we have a rule that is Y1. So if it's, and we're looking at the feet of the individuals here, that's where they locate. So here, if the value is less than Y1, then it's a cancer class. And if it's greater than Y1, it's a healthy class. So by doing that, we have a third rule. And that third rule splits the last mixed class into an individual set of cancer cases and an individual set of healthy cases. So you can see by combination of these three rules, we're able to split the population into multiple, completely into cancer or non-cancer classes. So that's a decision tree. The tree has branches, and those branches split the population into individual groups. So an extension of this is something called a random forest. And what do you have in a forest? Well, you have multiple trees. So a random forest mixes up the population, creating multiple trees. So it will take subsets of the population, mix them up, and then build a tree for each subset, and then cross-compare those trees. And then it allows effectively voting across those multiple trees to get a consensus of a result. And also it aggregates the trees together to create a solution. So that approach, effectively by randomizing the population, having multiple trees, each one of these is identical, I didn't change them, but effectively you have multiple trees that all give a slightly different view of the population, but kind of give a much more robust model at the end of the day. So a random forest is very much multiple trees built for a subset of the population. So these trees can be very complicated. You can have hundreds of branches if you're not careful, and they may not reflect a generalized model. So we overcome that by pruning. So we can cut some branches out at the cost of performance, but it gives us a more generalized solution, a solution that would work well for new cases. So that's kind of an overview of some of the methods that can be used. We can use those for molecular data. We can use those for making clinical and biological decision processes. And if you want to look into this further, then I would look into a piece of software called Weka. And Weka is from the University of Waikato in New Zealand. And it's very well supported by a lot of YouTube videos as well. So if you want to explore machine learning, look at this Weka piece of software. You can download it, you can play with machine learning methods, and also it's got a lot of video support that will train you in how to use it, but also give you a good training in a broader and deeper aspects of machine learning. Just one last point, people or my PhD students say to me that I don't have a brain and that I've built my career using an artificial brain. And there is some evidence to support that. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Graham, for the wonderful lecture. And you really simplified it so well, because audience is ranging from grade 9 to BSc and MSc students. So I'm sure there is something for everybody to learn here new. All right, so open for any questions, any point for clarification from the students. So please raise hands first if you have any questions. We know it has been a really long day for all of you, being last session now.
There's a question in the chat. Which language, Python or R, would be helpful? So I would say that they're both very good, Python and R. R has more statistical tools, but Python has more machine learning tools. So it depends which route you want to go. If you, but they're both very useful. There's a lot of support available. There's a lot of what I would say support material and courses available on those. The only thing I would say is often the methods that you use in Python and R, particularly for machine learning, are kind of somewhat off-the-shelf methods, and it's really the gold standard is to code your own machine learning algorithms in Java or C++ or the like. Okay, so there's another question. What are the ethical considerations or implications, sorry, of AI in healthcare? And it's like anything. Fire is a tool that's been invented by humans or used by humans. Fire can be a very bad thing and be very destructive, but can it be a very good thing? So the ethical implications boil back to that. If you're using it to try and make life better for humanity by making diagnosis, then that's a very positive thing to do, providing you use it as well on anonymous data if you're not a clinician. It can be used negatively though. Some people are saying, well, we don't want to share data because AI can be used to find out who we are and where we live and what all our personal information. That is only really the case in a very specific set of circumstances, and that would be very unethical to do that. Okay. There's a few more questions. Will there be any scope in future for transferring human brains data into chips and storing it? I would say actually Google is currently doing that, because if you think about the sum of human experience, that is kind of encapsulated in the web. And that information is kind of, whether it's not individualized, but if you capture all of the things that an individual sees, all the things they hear, all the things that their senses tell them, you have captured their life experience, but you haven't perhaps synthesized it into a thought process. So that can be perhaps the gap there. But in theory, if you capture all of that, then it's possible. Okay, epigenetics. Yes, we can use this for epigenetics by looking at a range of different patterns in things and finding out what's happening through populations. And we are doing that with IITB. So the questions are going off the top of the chat quicker than I can answer them at the minute, but let's have a look. So how important will AI be in the field of medicine? I think it's becoming very important. We're encouraging people who are following medicine masters or majors to have an awareness of AI. Matlab is not, is Matlab mandatory for life sciences and bioinformatics? No, it's just another tool we can use. Can be, deep learning can be used in COVID diagnosis or its eradication. Yes, IITB are working on diagnosis, and we're also looking at severity as well. Cox Transformation. So transformation is really a mathematical process where we want to try and apply a filter to data or a transformation in order to make that data more useful. So a Cox transformation is a way of effectively maximizing the patterns that you could find in data. And that transformation, though, it can be a good thing and a bad thing. It may actually lose information as well if you're not careful. Detecting neurological genetic diseases. So how can AI be used? Yes, we can look at the sequence data and work out whether somebody has a risk of a neurological disease. But we can also look at the transcriptome and the proteome to work out how their genes are expressed and where they are in the process of developing a neurological disease. Can AI help in genetic alterations? Potentially, but you need to know the downstream and upstream effects of those alterations more completely. Can we bring the dead back to life again? That's an interesting one. Depends how long they've been dead, I suppose. But
that's the toughest question you got for the AI.
Yes, I suppose this is a fundamental philosophical question, but can we use omics to find the fundamental energy of life? And that's a very challenging one, and there may be ethical implications for that. But yes, so there's a question, the baby of AI YouTube series, Baby X computerized child robot, he reacts to the sound of the scientists who are handling him. Is this communication is possible due to these decision tools? Yeah, so again, you have a model of information, content, reaction, and response. That reaction is based upon a set of rules that robot either has been programmed with or has learned from the data. There was a robot built about 100 years ago that fooled people. Remember Turing's test, which says, if it can fool a person, then it's true AI. But they thought it had got intelligence, but this robot had literally just been hard programmed with the probability of a given answer. So it wasn't true AI. True AI would actually learn based upon experience and react according to the question in the future. Yeah, so bias in AI. yes, there is a risk of introducing bias. You have to, it's all about the population that you put into the AI and how you handle that, and you know, making sure that you have good testing on unseen cases, good populations of individuals that are not been pre-selected, that are randomized from a population. So good, if you have good statistical principles in your individual selection, then that has a potential to have an unbiased model. Will AI result in unemployment in the future and replace the former jobs that we know at present? Yes, there is a strong chance of some of that. I know people who are working in legal profession who are saying that AI could replace them, legal decisions. There are people who are working in financial sectors who are saying the same. There are people working in medical sectors who are saying the same. What I would say is that ultimately AI should be a decision tool and not a replacement, because even AI can get it wrong sometimes. Can AI help communicate with animals? That's an interesting one. I did a project about 3 years ago where I was analyzing wolf howls and working out whether the wolf was on its own or in a pack, based upon the information content in the wolf howl. And it seemed to be apparent that you could detect subtleties in the frequency of the wolf howl that as to whether the wolf was communicating with a pack or just telling the pack it was on its own. I'm not sure how. There might be an awful lot of over extrapolation in that, but some species probably have more communication, such as cetaceans, whales and dolphins have more depth of communication than we have. So maybe we could understand that, but it's what you might find when you communicate. It might just be, can we have more fish, please? So, you know, it's tricky as to what the context of the individual species is. The Neuralink chip made by Elon Musk and the team, I think it's very early days. You have to be very careful my view in AI, you have to be very careful because there's an awful lot of hype. There's an awful lot of false statement about capability. And, you know, the truth is always what you see in the real result and not what people want you to see in the media's perception of that result. So
I think one of the student, Rohit, is continuously asking you about some applications possibility for box Cox transformation. If you have, you know, some example, if you can give.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with box Cox transformations particularly. I mean, if it's about equation generation, then, you know, people are trying to solve biology with simultaneous equations is one example of that, and the transformation of any form would allow that. You could argue that support vector machines are a transformation and will generate an equation, and likewise we can generate an equation from a neural network. So the equations from box Cox, though, might be trying to solve more fundamental mathematical problems, and there has been some suggestion that by using AI methods and running thousands and thousands of permutations through a particular equation, that some of that might be solved. But that's slightly out of my area of expertise.
So Rohit, you know, I think even when we do look at large data set, you know, for looking at the entire proteome or, you know, various type of omics data sets from different different individuals, we do see a lot of change in the signal intensity when we generate from the instruments like mass spectrometer, right? So there is a lot of need to do data transformation, right? And there are various different ways of trying to reduce those variables, how much you can reduce the variables. And therefore different you know, things can be tried over there, starting from various ways of looking at simple mean or median based transformation to other type of transformation methods. What you're asking is also one of the ways to reduce those variables, but of course, you know, it might be more applicable into certain specific application which we are not able to give you exactly where it is most applicable. But none of the transformation really works the best in any given context. You have to try out many different things to come up with the best strategy for that given data set, right? Like even when we look at data transformation and normalization, we have to look into a variety of ways to try it out and then see which one works best on that given data set. So it's good to be open and try out different things. So, all right. So, looks like participants have been really interacting well, and it has been they're really just beginning of the research trajectory. We have really given them a busy day from morning 10 a.m. till 5:30 p.m. So they have been continuously busy whole day. But I appreciate they are all maintaining their enthusiasm. And thanks so much, Mr. Graham, for sharing your wisdom, your understanding, your great experience working in this particular area. And of course, we
My
at IIT
pleasure.
Bombay have greatly benefited with your collaboration and interaction. And with this, I'm sure everybody else will also benefit immensely in future. Thank you